Okay. All right, today we are with Bo Carey, an authority on Loudon history. He is the owner of Greer's Home Furnishings, the oldest business in Loudon County, starting all the way back in 1890. But how long has the company been at this location?
It's my understanding that in 1890, Greer and Barron opened on the 500 block of Grove Street at what's now TikTok Ice Cream Parlor, and that John Greenway Greer, my great-grandfather, acquired a lot or two lots here on the 600 block of Grove there around 1891. I have the deed somewhere. And he, at 606 Grove Street, he built the first location around 1893. In 1900, Barron left, and he took on his brother-in-law, James Carmichael, as a partner, or as we knew him as Uncle Blizz. He was supposedly born during a blizzard. And that became Greer and Carmichael in 1900, at which point they built an adjacent equal-sized property, 25 feet wide storefront, in 1914. There's pictures around places like Dr. Lambert's office and other places around town shows Blizz Carmichael and John Greer out front when they were building that space at 606. So half of the two-story buildings were built in around 1893, the other half 1914. When Uncle Blizz got out in 1925 and sold his stock to his two nephews, Barksdale Greer and Carmichael Greer, they combined the two storefronts into one. And since that time, years later, some other adjacent pieces were added and acquired.
Tell me about your mom and dad. First, your mom.
Well, my mother, a great influence, and we all know people that probably had no enemies. I would say she was one of those people, but we all love her mother. She had sort of a unique upbringing in the Greer family. Her birth name was Betty Barksdale Greer. Her father was James Carmichael Greer, but she somehow became attached to her uncle, Barksdale Greer, John Barksdale Greer. He was a bachelor. He lived up on Wharf Street with his mother, who my mother was named for. She was Betty Carmichael Greer. And after Betty Carmichael Greer's husband died, she became somewhat lonely, and she wanted her granddaughter and namesake to spend time with her throughout the week. So whereas my grandparents' other two children always lived with them up on Fort Hill in the old Greer place and grew up there and spent every night of the week there, my mother stayed down here on Wharf Street with her grandmother and her Uncle Barksdale. And that was a big influence on her life. Her grandmother instilled discipline and I guess you'd say somewhat of a bit of self-esteem and all the good traits you can imagine. She made her practice piano every day. She made her come home from school and do her homework every day. She required her to be punctual, to be neat, and to do all the things that I can imagine. And I don't remember her teaching me and my brothers that many great traits as much as I remember her teaching her grandchildren all those traits. And when the grandchildren would come and stay with her, she would do the same thing her grandmother had done, and that would be to teach them good habits. If they weren't getting those good habits at home with their parents, they got them with her. And so, whereas a lot of grandparents spoil their grandchildren, my mother was one that absolutely was the played the tough cop role and made sure they learned good habits. And it's funny to this day, 18 years I guess or so after she died, my children and my nephews and nieces can all say, well, Graham taught us this, Graham taught us that. But she was born in 1929. She, over at Dr. Harrison's sanitarium, as it was called, sanitarium, whatever. And grew up here in Loudon, had great friends that she was friends with all through her life. She did go off to Salem in North Carolina to school at one point, and she was went to the University of Tennessee where she met my father, Bo Carey. He came from Memphis, where he was born and raised, and she, my mother had. They met at the University of Tennessee and I guess dated throughout for a couple of years there in college and got married. He was joined the Air Force right out of college and was out at the Air Force Stewart Air Force Base in Murfreesboro or Smyrna in Rutherford County, and they lived there. I was the firstborn. I was born in 1952. I don't remember it, but that was about the first year of my life, and then. They were in Memphis for a year. My dad took a job there, and then in 1954 they came back to Loudon, and they've been here ever since. He was a civil engineer that's his degree. And other than that 1 year in Memphis, I'm not sure if he did some surveying or something of that nature that he ever really did it. He came back here and worked at Greer's, and just as when they got married at the Loudon Methodist Church, they were the first wedding to take place in the new church after the old one had burned, and that would have been, I guess, 1951. That's another thing that my great-grandmother Betty Carmichael Greer instilled in my mother was faithfulness at the Loudon Methodist Church. The Reverend Paul Dodd married my parents there at that church, and she was active there for the rest of her life. It's funny, the Greers were what we call, I guess, the Greers were, if you go back a couple of more generations, were strict Covenanter Presbyterians. And but my great-grandmother was, her Methodist faith was too strong to allow that, and she switched the Greers over to the Methodist Church. So that was, speaking of my mother, that was her great love of the Methodist Church. She definitely would take all four of us boys there, and every Sunday that was part of our growing up. Sunday school, church, about anything you can imagine. My dad would go to Sunday school, but he had great attention span, but he didn't care much for sermons, so he would hightail it and usually miss the service. And we all had to go.
Well, what was it like growing up in the Carey household and being around the hardware store?
Well, I had three younger brothers, and we all, as long as I can remember, we lived on Fort Hill, which is where most of the Greers are. My cousins lived there. John Carmichael Greer's 4 children, and we played with them. We were just basically next door. Lots of fun, lots of kids around on the hillside to play with. Again, I remember the discipline. That was something both parents instilled in us. They just insisted that we live a disciplined life. You call it the hardware store, and that's what anybody that's lived here very long refers to it as the hardware. And it was, I guess, back in the day, in the 1890s, it was just a general store for farm supplies and whatnot. Somewhere around my Uncle Bart, the second generation, was what my dad referred to as the ultimate hardware man, and he really built up the hardware department. And my dad took a liking to that as well, so he expanded the hardware department. They took on the True Value co-op type program in the 1950s or 60s, And the hardware really grew, even though they were selling appliances and televisions and furniture, floor covering. At some point in the 60s, they were selling John Deere tractors and boat motors, Evinrudes and Johnstons, and floor covering, draperies, wallpaper. I think they had 35, 40 employees. So as a little boy, it was fun to come down to the hardware and hang around and meet a lot of the people coming in and out. Of course, small town retail was a much different thing in the 50s and 60s than it is today, where shopping centers and big metropolitan areas have stolen a lot of the glamour from the small town retail environment. Some of my fondest memories were, again, because my mother had grown up around her Uncle Bart on Wharf Street instead of in the home where she was born and should have been raised. She would send me down to my Uncle Bart's, and at that time, while he was still running the hardware, on Friday nights, and I'd stay Saturday and hang out all day Saturday and hang around the downtown. So that was a real bonus to me, was I got to meet the Wharf Street gang, all the Lefflers and the Jimmy Gray Harrison and Jimmy Carnes, and that was always there near the funeral home, and lots of people, and of course going to Richeson's and buying bubblegum sports cards and all that. So I got to basically on weekends be downtown or be on Wharf Street and play ball and hang out with the kids. The place that's now, I don't want to scatter away from the subject, but one of my fondest memories was what's now Cook and Craft Academy at 418 Wharf Street was, and prior to that it was a bank branch, but back in the day that was just the sandlot where we played ball. And if you could, we played knee high, where you'd hit the ball out there. If you could hit it out to College Street, somebody might get hit by a car, they might not, but they'd have to run the ball back in and then roll it and try to hit the bat in order to be the next batter. If you hit the ball over the railroad tracks, it was a home run. And so the Lawson boys and the Lefflers and the Presleys and the Fradys and the Simpsons and a lot of those folks that we played with up and down Wharf Street, we had a lot of fun playing there in that sandlot. And there were 3 different basketball courts up and down Wharf Street. One had a 12-foot goal, one had a 10-foot goal, and one had Charlie Davis had an 8-foot goal that you could dunk on if you were lucky. So yeah, that was a great time growing up. I know the question was about the hardware and whatnot. Before I forget, we talked about Uncle Bart and my mother's unusual relationship with living basically with her grandmother and her uncle instead of her mother and father. Now that didn't mean she didn't go up the hill and have meals and be loved by her mother and father and her two siblings. But when they did get married at the Loudon Methodist Church, my Uncle Bart was the one to give her away. Wow. And, that was a pretty neat trick, and his brother didn't mind that. He didn't mind that situation. And my grandfather died in 1954. I don't remember him, so I would have been 2 years old. That was Carmichael Greer, and of course he ran the mills. He was an owner here, but he never worked at Greer's. He ran the mill for Colonel Bacon as a general manager, but he died in '54, and that was about the time my parents moved back here to Loudon and started their life here.
Oh. So that's Barksdale.
Barksdale. His real name was John Barksdale Greer. There's been a John Greer every generation, going back to Scotland, and Northern Ireland, But yes, the John Greenway Greer started the company. His son, John Barksdale Greer, was the second generation owner, manager. His grandson, John Carmichael Greer, was the third generation partner of my dad, Ham Carey, and they were brother-in-laws. And then he has a son, John C. Greer Jr., who's not active in the business, lives in Nashville. So for what it's worth.
A lot of Johns.
A lot of Johns. And same thing on our side. My dad is John Hamill Bowen Carey. He goes by the Ham from Hamill. I am John Hamill Bowen Carey Jr., and I take the Bow from the Bowen. And my son is John Hamill Bowen Carey III, so we call him John. Trivia.
Trivia. Well, we know you were educated in Loudon schools, the Loudon Elementary, the junior high, and the high school. In looking back, can you name a few teachers who stood out to you, and why did they stand out?
In which school?
In any of those.
Okay. Well,
You can start with elementary, then go
okay.
to junior.
I was my brother Bart. I have a brother Barksdale Greer Carey, and he and I were at some a wedding or something in Knoxville a while back, and some friend that had gone to, I guess, private schools was asking about our elementary school, and it's a grammar school, we called it. You know, it was grammar school and junior high back then, not middle school and elementary school. But he said, well, I was a pretty good student. I was in the A group. And he said, why did they call it that? I said, well, they had the A group, the B group, and the C group. And that was depending on your mental capacity or how well you advanced in school. And he said, you mean they segregated you by your educational ability? He said, yeah. He said, that's horrible. Said, well, that's what they did.
Oh, yeah.
Then they had an upper first, if you want to hear about that. Well,
That's right.
and so this guy was just shocked. Every time I see him to this day, he asked me, he said, did they really do that in Atlanta? I said, yeah, but I don't think anybody was harmed from it.
They did that everywhere. At the
Okay.
time.
Well,
Yeah.
see, this preppy didn't have he wasn't blessed to be around that.
Yeah.
But I know that